So this is just a disclaimer, guys, before we go into the episode, that we do talk about numbers a little bit and calories. So if you're feeling particularly vulnerable, then feel free to skip this episode and we will see you in the next one.
Hello, I'm Becca,
And I'm Katy.
and you're listening to the Once Upon a Binge podcast. If you find yourself struggling with binge eating, body image, or perfectionism, then this is the podcast for you.
Join us, two former binge eaters and recovering perfectionists, as we share our experiences of overcoming binge eating, learning to accept our bodies as they are, and letting go of the fairy tale myth of perfection.
Now let's get into today's episode.
That is so
I can't believe you've just done that.
I'm embarrassed for myself. That was
Well, it's
not
my
my
sound
finest
settings,
moment.
okay.
You sound great. You sound crisp and clear.
I thank you. So do you now, eventually.
Nice. It only took us 10 minutes.
Yeah. I don't know if there's listeners will be listening by this point, but if they are, we just spent 10 minutes trying to get our mic set up. Well, Katie's mic set up because it wasn't working, and she just had it on mute. Okay.
I am technically challenged.
I think we both are. I don't know how we've managed to produce a podcast with how technically challenged we both are.
Honestly, but this is where we get stressed though, isn't it? This part is fine. Anything outside of the conversation, that's where things get a bit challenging.
If we ever make it big with podcasters, I think the first thing we'll do is hire a tech person to just do all that for us.
If you do it, I don't want to know. Don't care what you do. Have fun.
Isn't it interesting though that some people genuinely find like tech interesting and like solving tech problems fascinating, whereas for me, just want to tear my hair out with them. I'm like, why is it not working? It should.
Well, I can't get my head around it. It doesn't make sense to me. So I can't understand it. It's like maths. Okay? Which you'd think very straightforward, logical numbers. No, my brain just cannot. Anything outside of the basics, I'm no use to anyone.
Yeah. Well, I have, people who are into like maths and tech, that's why they like it, because it's like, it's an equation, isn't it? You do X and you get Y. But in my experience, it doesn't work like that, because I've tried to fix tech things before and followed instructional videos and been like, but I've done X, Y, Z and I'm not getting the outcome I should. So why do people speak about it being logical and straightforward?
It's a good question, Becca. It's a good question.
Well, we all have our strengths. That's not ours, and that's fine.
I'm trying to think how we can intersect that into the topic for today.
I don't think we can.
But I don't think we can. With the best will in the world, it's not going to happen, is it?
There's no segue there at all, I don't think. What is the topic for today, Katie?
We are talking about food obsession.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling obsessed with food. And I was actually thinking about this morning, not just because we were recording this podcast today, by the way, but these past few days, I wake up in the morning and I'm getting ready and I'm doing my stuff. And I'm like, I really, really want a hot chocolate today. I really want that. I really want a hot chocolate with some cream and maybe a flake, who knows. And I'm like, I'm going to have that this afternoon. Like, I've got a little window in the afternoon. That's what I'm going to have. That's my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I completely forget about it for the rest of the day. And then the next morning I wake up, I'm like, oh yeah, really want a hot chocolate. I didn't do that yesterday. And anyway, I've done that 3 days in a row. And I finally have a hot chocolate here with me now on the podcast, recording, drinking my hot chocolate. All of that to say, that kind of experience felt so alien to me when I felt obsessed with food. Like if I woke up and started thinking about a certain food, whether that was like a hot chocolate or a piece of chocolate or some ice cream that I had in the freezer, the minute that entered my brain, it became very hard to not think about that food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why do you think it's different for you now?
Many, many reasons, but
It's not too big of a question.
The main ones being, just to kind of, I guess, preempt the discussion that's going to happen today, is I am not in a state of hunger.
Mm-hmm.
Not even just like in the moment hunger, but hunger that's as a result of periods of previous restriction.
Accumulative hunger.
That's the one. That's the word. Accumulative hunger. I don't have scarcity around food anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really big one. I would say, I'm trying to think of the other reasons actually. Permission. I have permission around food. I don't moralize food and my choices around food. Food feels very neutral for me. You think of anything else, Becca?
No, well, if that's how it feels for you, and I think that all makes sense.
Yeah.
Definitely, and something that we can probably touch on today in more detail. It's interesting that you wake up and fancy a hot chocolate, though, because it made me think. I used to always view like hot chocolate as like an evening thing, like something you do before you go to bed, cozy, have hot chocolate, and then you go to sleep. And this year, I actually started having hot chocolates like earlier in the day, sometimes having them on a morning and really enjoying that. And I think that's partly because I can't drink coffee anymore. It like irritates my belly and my bowel too much. Like, to put it bluntly, I'm going to crap myself if I have a coffee. So I have to look at like alternative options to having like a nice warm drink on a morning. And that's usually like tea or hot chocolate. Then it's actually really nice to have a hot chocolate first thing on a morning. And I suppose similarly to you kind of reflecting on the past and now, in the past, I would have never have done that because it would have been a rule in my brain that chocolate is something you have the end of a night as a treat or something. It's not something that you have on a morning. So if I was to do that, it would be me breaking that rule, and that would have really thrown me off. And I would have like judged myself and been really harsh and critical on myself for having done that in the morning. And then that would have sent me into a negative headspace. Like kind of that sort of fuck it mentality of, right, well, broken a rule first thing in the morning, so I might as well just throw it all out the window for today. I'll get back on it tomorrow, that kind of thing. So it's really interesting to see now that that's just not there. It's like, if I want a hot chocolate on a morning, I'm going to have a hot chocolate on a morning, because who created these rules? You can have a hot chocolate whenever you want, right?
Absolutely. If I was restricting, even if I had this mindset of I had to eat a certain way, or that clean eating, or even just a lot of shoulds, like to what you were speaking about, when you should and shouldn't have these foods. If I was living like that and I had woken up and really felt like I did this morning and the other mornings, I really, really want that hot chocolate and that's what I want. There would have been this back and forth battle in my head for the rest of the day. My day would have been spent thinking, do I have the hot chocolate now? Do I not have the hot chocolate? Do I have the whipped cream with it? No, probably shouldn't. That's too much. Do I have a low calorie option because I can't have a proper one? Do I have it with water instead of milk because that's probably better? It would have been this mental gymnastics all day. And I think when your relationship with food is experienced in the way that feels very, what's the word I'm looking for? When you feel so preoccupied with food, like you build this like momentum, don't you? And this energy builds. And then you come to this inevitable breaking point, whether that's the end of the day, whether that's the following day, where, as you were speaking of, it's like, oh, screw it, I'm going to have it.
Yeah.
And then you have everything. Because I have memories of having the quote unquote healthier option of the hot chocolate and not feeling satisfied and not enjoying it and wondering why it didn't satisfy the craving, and still finding myself thinking about what else I can have to satisfy myself. And just really what I'm going on and on about is feeling like all you think about is food, when to have it, when not to have it, how much to have it, to a point where it really does feel like that is all your brain actually thinks about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. What you're speaking about is that analogy that you see a lot of people like post about online, isn't it? Where it's like, okay, you want to have a chocolate bar, but you're telling yourself you can't have it. So you have an apple instead. You still want the chocolate bar because the craving is still there. And so you have, I don't know, some rice cakes, still want the chocolate bars. Then you go and have like another bit of fruit. And you keep having all of these quote unquote like healthy options. And then in the end, that tension is just like that momentum. You described it as momentum and energy around it. Like from my experience, I experience that as like, it's like tension in your body, like this energy just building up. You feel so tense and it doesn't know where to go. It can't be released. I suppose like if you were to pump up a balloon and the balloon is just getting like fuller and fuller and fuller and fuller. And eventually that balloon's got to pop, it's got to burst. And then when it bursts, it's when you have the chocolate bar. But because there's so much like tension or energy or momentum behind it, you don't just have the one chocolate bar, you have the whole packet or you have whatever else with it. So you've actually just gone and eaten like a load of other stuff and the thing that you wanted and stuff on top of it. Whereas if you actually allowed yourself to have the permission to have that one chocolate bar and really enjoy it and just have the satisfaction from that, um, you're more likely to stop there.
Yeah. When you don't allow it, it snowballs like that. In comes the shame and the guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it further instills this belief that you may have that you cannot be trusted around food. Like, you cannot have these foods. This is what happens when I have these foods, when I think about these foods. The way forward is to limit these foods. The thing that we do that we think is helping us is the very thing that's keeping it going. Because when I think about feeling obsessed with food, and I don't know whether you relate to this, and I may or may not keep this in, but like, I think people talk about food obsession and people talk about food addiction, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
They can be used kind of interchangeably. And what I will say, without really going too far into something else, is the behavior as a result of feeling obsessed around food, that felt addictive. The psychological side of it, the thinking about food all the time and feeling like I either needed to be around food because it's all I could think about, and I was watching food shows, making food for people, being around it, and also feeling like I needed to not be alone with food. That side of things, the psychological side, that felt more like food obsession, if that makes sense. So when I think about them, I felt it differently from a psychological point to a physical point. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
Yeah. So from a psychological perspective, you resonated with the term obsession. Whereas when it came to like physical or a biological perspective, it felt like an addiction for you. Which is definitely something I think I'd like us to go into a little bit more today. But I'm curious, did you at the time when you actually were living with an eating disorder, would you have used the terms obsessed with food or addicted to food? Is that how you would have actually felt about yourself as you were experiencing it? And the reason I ask this is because I think this is a really interesting topic. But from my perspective, when I was living with an eating disorder, I actually didn't use those terms to describe myself. I never really had the thought of I'm obsessed with food or I'm addicted to food. But looking at how I would describe feeling like obsessed with food, that was there. So the kind of the constant food thoughts, the occupation with food, like all the time, compulsiveness around food, that feeling like when I start eating, can't stop. And kind of that always watching like cooking programs or programs that involve like food, and always wanted to be the person that hosts and puts on the food for everyone. Like all of that was there, which I would say are like signs of food obsession or what people would describe as a food obsession. But I just didn't use those terms to describe myself in the moment. Like it's just not what I felt.
I definitely felt like there was something wrong with me. Like, my relationship with food was different to anyone else's around me. And as a result, I carried a lot of shame about my appetite and my behavior around food. And there was things that I did that I've carried deep shame around in terms of how I would behave around food. Things that would even test like my moral compass at this point, you know what I mean? And so when I behaved a certain way with food, when I was binging, when I was eating food that wasn't mine to eat, that kind of thing, it felt like something is happening to me and this is wrong. Something is very wrong. That behavior made me feel like, is this an addiction? But when I thought about it, like, wait, I'm addicted to food. When I thought about it like that, my immediate reaction was, Katy, you are pathetic. Being addicted to food, that is so embarrassing. Like, what is wrong with you? Everyone else can control themselves around food. No one else has this problem. So what's wrong with you? This is something you're doing wrong.
What I take from what you've said there is, I think probably how a lot of people would feel. I think it's relatable because I think when you're struggling with issues with food, we can be so incredibly like harsh on ourselves because it's something that we need, like sleep, like oxygen to survive. It's a fundamental part of life, isn't it? So when we end up struggling and getting into these battles with food or feeling like we don't have any control around food, we can then be really harsh about ourselves because we compare ourselves to our younger selves and thinking like, I wasn't born this way. Like, you're not born with an eating disorder. It's something develops over time. So I think for me, that's why we can be really harsh on ourselves, because we think it's something that we should just know how to do because it's something we need for survival.
Yes, I hear you. Would you say that then what you were talking about, all the ways in which you were experiencing food obsession, although you weren't identifying it as such, did it feel like, oh, something's not right here? Were you aware of it? Or is it something that you've recognized more so coming out the other side?
It's a good question. I feel like there's a yes and a no answer to it.
Okay.
So bear with me. I feel like the reason I didn't use the terms food obsession is partly how my issues with food developed, because it started as bulimia. And I think, as I might have mentioned on the podcast before, because there was that purging aspect of self-induced vomiting, I knew quite early on this is an eating disorder. Whereas if I had not had that purging aspect and it had been restriction or the binging, I might have found that harder to have named that as an eating disorder. Mainly because restriction is very normalized in our society. And I think there is so much shame and judgment around the binging side. Those messagings about, oh, you just, haven't got discipline, you haven't got willpower, you're just greedy, that kind of messaging. I think if it was the restriction or the binging on its own, I would have probably had more thoughts like, oh, I'm obsessed with food, I'm addicted to food, what's wrong with me? But because that purging aspect had been there, I was quite quick to be able to name this as like, this is an eating disorder that I'm experiencing. And even when that purging stopped and then it moved into restriction and then maybe into binging, I still carried that initial label of it being an eating disorder. I was able to apply that to it. So that's the yes and no.
So excellently put, I must say. Round of applause.
Oh, thank you. This makes me want to ask, I want to go into, I guess, the reasons people will feel obsessed with food. And I think one of the biggest and maybe the most obvious things to talk about is restriction and how that can leave people to feel obsessed with food. And I want to draw on the experiment, the Minnesota Starvation experiment. In case she's nodding her head like, yeah, that makes sense. And some listeners will know about it and other people not. I think that it's worth us talking about it today because I think it's such a good example of how food obsession can develop and how we feel it. Do you want to describe it, Katie, or do you want me to describe it?
You can describe it because I will probably butcher it.
You won't. You absolutely won't. So I'll describe it, but if there's any things that I'm missing, Katie, please jump in. So the Minnesota starvation experiment was an experiment done, I think it was around World War II time, because the researchers wanted to test impact on malnourishment and semi-starvation on people during the war, so they could figure out how can you sort of refeed this person or help them get back to healthy nourishment levels. So what they did was take, I think it was like 30 something men, healthy men who were physically healthy and had healthy, they were like psychologically healthy. They were tested, weren't they, beforehand? And they put them on semi-starvation diet. So instead of eating, I think was it 3,200 calories a day, started off with that at the beginning for like 12 weeks. And then after that, there was the experimental phase, which was 24 weeks. And men had to eat I think it was 1,560 calories. It was around the 1,600 mark, which I think is a really interesting thing to latch onto, because a lot of diets nowadays do promote that 1,600 calorie amount, some even less, which is very concerning. So these men ate like that for 24 weeks. And the foods that they ate were, whole foods. So it was mainly like potatoes, vegetables, meat, that kind of thing. They didn't eat, quote unquote, like highly palatable foods or any highly processed foods. And the results of the experiment were absolutely shocking, really, and have been very helpful for a lot of eating disorder treatment and just for our understanding of how eating disorders affect people. Some of the effects that happened to people was this kind of preoccupation with food that the men who had taken part in this experiment felt like they were obsessed with food, that they constantly thought about food nonstop. And some people reported having like dreams of food. Even one man had like dreams of cannibalism, and he actually had to be taken into a psychiatric hospital for treatment because of that. A lot of them reported binge eating, feeling like they could not regulate their appetite or get back to a normal appetite. What else happened? People reported chewing excessive amounts of chewing gum, drinking excessive amounts of coffee. They were very ritualistic, or they would play with their food. They tried to delay like meals, like delay how long it took them to eat meals, so they'd prolong that process. And also putting like strange combinations of food together. So when the men would binge, they would like take really bizarre combinations. So they put like potatoes with jam and bread and gingerbread biscuits and all sorts of stuff, and like mix it all together and eat it. And I just think this is, and I think people would like read cookbooks for fun. Like the men in the studies who had never really shown any interest in food before, who were just quite neutral about food and weren't interested in cooking, would read cookbooks for fun. And I think one man even went on to become like a chef after the experiment because of this. And what I probably should have said is actually after the 24 weeks of the experimental phase, they then went back to controlled phase of refeeding, which I think was another 12 weeks. So these men afterwards were encouraged to, like they were supported to basically rebuild their body weight, because a lot of them lost a lot of weight during the process. So they were supported in that, but they still experienced some of these symptoms, like their cognition dropped, their concentration dropped, even body dysmorphia set in. So some of the men had lost like 25% of their body weight, and they couldn't even recognize it. Like they didn't realize that they could, what we would see in terms of how like malnourished or how much weight they'd lost, they couldn't see that themselves. So they had body dysmorphia. And I think this is so critical for us understanding actually impact of physical restriction would have on us. Because actually, 24 weeks in a very controlled environment with men who had healthy relationships with food. And that's the impact that it had on some of these men. And a lot of them reported that it was the not so much the physical hunger that was the hardest thing, it was the psychological impact that the study had on them that was the hardest. And yet there is a lot of people out there, and I want to mainly say women because of how diet culture is more pushed on women, who have spent years trying to live within the 1,600 calorie limit. I think that's normal. Because I speak for myself here, like when I was in that part of my life, if I went over that, I thought that was quote unquote bad. And if I could achieve like maybe 1,200 calories, that was what I felt was a good day. But understanding the study, when I discovered the study, this was really helpful for me in actually realizing harm that might be doing to myself. And in the refeeding phase, some of these men were eating like 11,000 calories a day just to get themselves to having normal hunger and fullness cues and feeling psychologically healthy around food again. I feel like I'm talking for a really long time here about this study. But when I understood that study, it felt relatable for me because I experienced some of those things, you know? I would dream about food. I remember one time waking up in the morning and finding a plate next to my bed where I had woken up, gone and got food and eaten it in my sleep and gone back to sleep and woke up in the morning and actually never even known I'd really done that because my body was just so hardwired to get food that I wasn't giving it. Kind of idea of combining really weird foods together just to get whatever calories or nutrients I could in, that is relatable. The constant food thoughts is relatable. A lot of these men they would try and sneak food in as well. That was something that they tried to do during the study. And I definitely remember being like sneaky around food. Or one thing that I felt a lot of shame about, but I'm going to mention it because I don't want other people to feel shame about this, is eating food out the bin. Like I'd throw food away and I would go and back and eat food out the bin because my body was just that desperate for food. Drinking a lot of coffee, that's relatable. That's probably why I've got issues with coffee, like in my belly now. But yeah, I don't know. I just think that this is really a really important study to mention when we talk about people feeling obsessed with food, because if someone is restricting and they have been restricting for a long time, and these are some of the symptoms they're experiencing, you're not broken. Your body is hardwired to have food and it will do whatever it can to try and survive and to get that food. This study shows that. And if you're experiencing it, please take something away from that study.
You're not alone in that, Becca. I've definitely done the same thing with food. And I know there'll be listeners that will feel exactly the same. You know, as I touched on earlier, there was ways I behaved around food that felt so far removed from who I was. Two of the main things that I really took away from the Minnesota starvation experiment, which I found really helpful, was that because I was always an avid calorie counter, and getting my head around it and thinking, okay, so there's a reason that my body couldn't survive when I was trying to eat less than 1,200 calories a day. You know, that there is a reason that you experience backlash from that. And I also found it so interesting about how even when they went through that refeeding process, how a lot of those behaviors still presented themselves for quite some time. It wasn't a simple thing of like, 6 weeks of eating the calories we normally would and we're back to normal, because and even now I'm 4 years, 4 years recovered. You know, that's a long period of time to be eating consistently, not restricting. And yet my body still doesn't like if I go too long between meals. And not intentionally. If there's a day where I'm just back to back, I can feel that sense of urgency in my body. And there is still a part of me that's like, we don't like this. It's definitely lessened. It doesn't feel distressing. But that's after 4 years of eating food and going through I did the sort of all-in approach with recovery, so eating a considerable amount of food. And I think that really speaks to how, like, it can read as traumatizing in the body when you are restricting it from what it needs. And it will always come back to get you, because we cannot outthink our biology. Trust me, I tried for well over a decade. We cannot do that. And that part of the experiment really was quite insightful for me, because it made me realize, like, okay, there is a process here. There is a lot of repair that takes place. And I think as well, that's also probably what lends to speaking about, which we won't go into today, but like the need to kind of overshoot with food and to eat more to make up for it. But I will say, though, giving yourself permission to eat in a way that is unconditional, when you really believe or feel you have evidence to believe that you eat too much and you need to eat less, that has got to be one of the hardest things to do, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's very easy for me to sit here and say one of the best things I did to help my food obsession was to give myself permission to eat. And that just always sounds overly simplistic when you deliver it like that. Because it's like, that's so not that straightforward, because that's incredibly scary to do. But that is what I needed to do. I needed to eat, and tying it back to the experiment, this was what was really helpful. And it was like, my body really doesn't trust me around food, and it's going to take time for me to eat and eat more than I probably think I need in order to repair from the damage that's been done. Because our brain is thinking about food because it wants us to get the food. If it knows the food is there, if it has proof that it is available, that is when it starts to lessen, right? There's a reason you're thinking about food all the time, because your brain is smart. Your body is smart, and it's telling you it wants it. It's telling you that that's what it needs. I don't really know where I'm going with this now.
It can sound simple when people mention it. It's a hard process to put your trust in, definitely. But I do think it's still helpful to hear it repeatedly, because when I first heard that idea, there was a lot of resistance to it. But through repeatedly hearing it from different people, whether that be like different people online on social media or different podcasts, I think the more you hear something and hear reports of having worked for another person, the more you start to feel able to put a little bit more trust in it. So I still think it's helpful to mention, even though we're not saying it's an easy thing to do at all.
I think this is why I benefited so much from having the WhatsApp support with a coach, because I really needed someone to reassure me every single day that I was allowed to eat. I was eating a lot of food. Is this okay? I really needed to hear someone else reassure that, because similar to you, I think I had a good few months of trying to get my head around the concept of giving yourself permission to eat and what that looked like and how that was going to play out. And to anyone who is listening at a stage where you're in disorder and the idea of giving yourself permission feels like a huge no and is met with resistance, I felt that as well. And you're allowed to let these concepts sit with you for a bit. They're allowed to marinate. You don't have to be on board with these things. You can let it be for a bit before it feels like it's something that you can actually look to integrate.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there's one thing somebody telling you it or saying it works for them, and that's one thing. Then having the readiness in yourself to do that, or the trust in yourself to do that, is a different thing. And they don't come simultaneously. You don't hear someone say it and then instantly you feel ready and trusting in yourself. I think there is definitely a period of hearing information multiple times, letting it kind of sink in, thinking about how that might apply to you and how you could imagine that happening, and processing all of the fears that come up when you imagine that. reflecting on what you've been experiencing and what you've been doing however many years and how that's making you feel and where you want to be. And then eventually all of that coming together and being like, I'm ready now. Like, I'm ready to do this. Let's go. Let's just take a leap of faith and go for it.
Yeah, spot on.
So what would you say to somebody who AG looks scared?
I know, I don't know why. Worst comes to worst, I can just leave the Zoom call.
The remainder of the podcast will be with me. What would you say to somebody who hasn't got that history of restriction, who they genuinely don't feel they restrict, or they actually don't restrict, and they feel like they constantly are overeating or constantly binging, or maybe they're eating quote unquote normally, but then they're binging, and it's more like they just feel like they're not able to stop, in particular with certain foods, particularly like highly palatable foods. I think this is where people get into this trap of feeling like, well, I do actually eat 3-4 meals a day and I don't experience physical restriction. I'm not depriving myself. But when it comes to certain foods, I cannot stop with them. And I just feel like I'm obsessed with them. I just feel like I'm obsessed with food. What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh. Well, depends on the person, obviously. Preface with that. But things I would actually look to explore with someone is I would see if it sounded like they were eating enough food, because I would have told you when I started recovery, like, no, I eat plenty of food, and I actually didn't eat plenty of food. And I've experienced that with quite a few clients where they come to me and they're like, no, I'm not physically restricting. And then they tell me what they eat. And I'm like, that is not enough food. That is not enough food. You are hungry. I would also then look to explore the mental side of things, especially if someone's experiencing like a cycle of, I eat a certain way in the day, and then come the evening, there I am in the cupboards, I'm going to these foods and I don't understand. Da, da, da. I would want to explore the narrative that's going on around that experience, the judgment that's coming up from that behavior, the shame that's coming up from that, how you're responding on the other side of that. You know, if there's this like, okay, tomorrow I won't do that. Tomorrow I will hide the foods. I will put this in place. I will, that the mental restriction that can feel really sneaky when it feels like it's for our own good, right? When it can feel like, but I shouldn't be eating this much food in the evening. So this is the right thing to do. And again, there's nuance there, because some people, depending on your context, can depend on whether there needs to be boundaries around food and when there doesn't. And I would explore food rules, because what you kind of spoke about even at the beginning of this podcast about just the kind of little things that we may not realize are there. Like, no, I can't have a hot chocolate at 10 o'clock in the morning. I can't do that. So if there's certain foods that aren't integrated into your day, things like chocolate, crisps, if they're not something that you experience outside of that evening window, that's going to be your one opportunity, right? There is going to be a part of you that's going to say, this is our opportunity now, we will take it.
Yeah.
Right?
Shown a lot. I think actually what you've shared is some really, really helpful points for listeners to reflect on. Some of the stuff that you've mentioned. And obviously you can work with Katy if you would like to as well. I'm just going to promote her there.
Thank you.
Well, all of those routes of exploration that you've described, I think will be really helpful for listeners.
Yeah.
Definitely that mental side of restriction, because I think we can physically be eating enough, but mentally.
Yeah. And I think
there's some rules around it.
Yeah. Like all of the restriction, it can vary in severity, can't it? So you can feel like, no, I let myself have a chocolate bar. I have a chocolate bar with my lunch. Okay. But is there a part of you that's like, I can only have this one chocolate bar, and this feels okay because I did spin this morning, so this doesn't feel as bad. Like just little things like that, if there is disordered behavior around food, it's gonna just have a different impact on you than someone who doesn't have a disordered relationship with food. Like my twin sister, she can speak a bit like that with food. And I think I probably drive her mad 'cause I'm like, "You have permission to eat. You're allowed to eat. You tell yourself you can't, you're gonna want it more." She just rolls her eyes at me at this point. But she doesn't respond in the same way because she hasn't got a history of disordered eating.
Yeah.
And not to say that you can't get to a point in your life where you can say, no, one chocolate bar is enough. I don't need four. That does happen. But if you are in a stage where you are trying to recover from overeating episodes, binging episodes, then it is going to look a little bit different in that recovery process before you get to a point where things can start to feel a little bit more neutral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what I find quite helpful with this? And I didn't actually know this at the time in my own recovery, but it's something I've learned through my training in counseling and psychotherapy. And I think it's quite, some people might not find it helpful, but I'm going to share it in case it is, because I find it a helpful model and I can see how it applied to me with this kind of what you described there, with this negotiation and the mental restriction side of things. There's like a model called transactional analysis, and it says that we all have in us like a parent state, an adult state, and a child state. And the way I see this in these three states is parent state is that part of you which is putting all these rules in place of you can't eat this, you can't eat that, you shouldn't have more than this, because they do talk about in transactional analysis there being critical parent state. So it's the critical parent telling you what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and trying to, control what you're doing. And the child state of you, like for some time, you're like, yes, okay, I listen to that. This is when you're conforming to all of those rules and you're following all those rules and you are able to stick to that diet. And that's the child part of you conforming to what the parent is dictating to you. But then eventually we all have this other child state in us, which is like rebellious. And when our parents tell us to do something, we're like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'll show you. You're going to tell me I'll do this? Well, I'm not going to. And I feel like that really helps me look back on some of my experiences and make a bit more sense of it, in thinking all these rules were being pushed onto me. And that was my critical parent. And when I pushed back against it and wanted to, in the form of a binge, it was my inner child state rebelling against that critical parent. And the goal of transactional analysis is to try and meet yourself in your adult state, which is about thinking from here and now perspective of what do I need right now in this moment, and thinking logically and rationally, and not getting pulled into either of that critical parent or that rebellious child. So that might be being like, well, actually, I do want to have a chocolate bar right now, and that would be really enjoyable to have that. So I'm going to have that. And then I'm also going to have whatever my lunch is, and I'm going to move on, and I'm going to just stick with here and now moment. I don't know if that feels feels relatable to what you're sharing, but from my perspective, that's how I find it quite helpful to view it. And if anything pops up for me now, later down the line, I do find it helpful to be like, oh, that's a critical parent popping in, or, oh, that's me trying to rebel a little bit. And I think it's just can be a helpful analogy to hold in mind, can sometimes guide you in these moments to recognize what's going on.
I so relate. I have such a strong inner rebel that I didn't realize till I started recovery. And I think that's why I personally needed to do all in, because I needed no rules. I had lived so long in rigidity and everything was regimented. If I was going to allow permission to eat, it had to be away from all those rules. I was so rebellious against the rules. So that's actually really interesting hearing you speak of it like that. And I can recognize my inner rebel now, even outside the context of food. And it's always quite interesting, because I'm like, okay, what are you trying to say here? What are you speaking up for? Do we need to be this loud, or do we just need a moment here? Do we just need to be named and let it exist for a little bit? Because Sometimes my inner rebel can be to my detriment. But that was helpful. Thank you, Becca. Thanks for sharing that.
I felt like we mentioned it a bit at the beginning
Mm-hmm.
around like food addiction and how obsession and addiction can sometimes be used interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it might be worth us touching on addiction a little bit and why it can feel like that. And I think when we look at addiction, food addiction, and people describe feeling addicted to food, I think we cannot not discuss, is it right? Cannot not discuss the role of dopamine and what that plays in food and eating in particular. Kind of the idea of sort of binging on highly palatable foods, because that's where I think a lot of people feel this even more. Like whenever it comes to foods like chocolate or crisps or pizza or whatever it is, these highly palatable foods. And by that, I mean foods that are quite calorie dense. They do activate that dopamine system in our brain because of it being calorie dense and because they're high in sugar, high in fats, things like that. I refer to them now from a recovered perspective as like fun foods or party foods, because they're the kind of foods that you often see parties. But highly palatable foods, some people call them that. Some people call them like ultra processed foods as well. But personally, I just think party foods or fun foods, it has less judgment around them. So that feels like a nicer way to refer to them for myself. And I think it's around these foods that often people do start to feel addicted to them. Like when I eat them, I cannot stop eating those kind of foods because of what's happening with the dopamine part of our brain. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's where this sugar addiction stems from. And I think, isn't it the Overeaters Anonymous model? It's a lot of cutting out those foods and abstaining from them. I would say I'm actually reading a book about this right now, which I'm finding really interesting, about how restrictive eating disorders can be addictive. And I would say that I got more of a high from restricting than I ever did from binging. Actually, I definitely got the high from binging. I definitely experienced that. I got more when I was restricting food, when I was saying no to food, when I was limiting my food. That felt more like that high than binging did, which is interesting.
Did that feel like a high from like a biological perspective? Because for me, I can relate to this feeling like these highly palatable fun foods are getting like a biological high from them. Whereas the restrictive side, I can relate to getting more of a high from it in terms of like a moral high and moral feeling of superiority. So they're kind of different sorts of high in my experience.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I will say that it felt like a physical high because I used to do a lot of fasting. It felt like nirvana. It felt like I never needed to eat again. That felt like this euphoric state that I would be in.
You know, I wonder if that does still fit in with like dopamine, because in the book Dopamine Nation, they I can't remember the name of the author.
Anna Lemke?
Something like that, yeah.
There's a silent
She does talk about this, like the seesaw of dopamine, doesn't she? Of like, we often think of dopamine as just being reward. So when you feel good off something, you're getting a rush of dopamine and you feel good off it, which can be confusing for people who like binge on these highly palatable foods. And they'll be like, well, actually, no, I don't feel good on them. I feel bloody awful afterwards. She brings in the idea of pain and pleasure are really critical to the dopamine reward system. And for example, with these foods, we feel pleasure from them because they activate the system. But if we eat them more, or if we eat them in like larger quantities, for example, if we like binge on them every night, we start to like become desensitized to the dopamine of it. So we need to have more of them to get the same kind of high. But at the same time, the pleasure we experience from them has to be in balance with pain as well. So we can't experience the pleasure without experiencing pain. So after so long of maybe getting into a cycle of eating these foods and getting a high off them, we have to have a big come down afterwards, because the more pleasure we get from these foods, the more we have to have a come down and experience the pain. And if we've got into the cycle of binging on these foods a lot or eating these foods like constantly, we end up just being in like this state of pain or discomfort or, distress or whatever you would describe it as emotionally.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm the best at explaining this, but
with restriction for me, when I was fasting, like I got to a point where I needed to fast longer to reach the same kind of euphoric place.
yeah,
It was no longer just, oh, this will do it. It was okay, now I have to do this and I have to do this and I have to do this to reach that.
So did the fasting feel like the pleasure part? Like, did it feel like it was the pleasure part of that seesaw, or did it feel like it was the pain part of the seesaw? Because from an external point of view, I wonder if like the fasting was like the pain side. So when you ate, the food would feel more pleasurable, but it might not be. It might not have been like that for you.
Well, it might have been. It felt pleasurable at the time.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe something to think on. I don't know. But it can set up this vicious cycle, can't it? Because we experience the pain, so then we want to seek the pleasure more, but then the more we seek the pleasure, we feel the pain more. And then it becomes a vicious cycle. And that is why I think it can feel like an addiction, because of what's going on with us in terms of our neurotransmitters in our brain. Whether food addiction is real or actually exists, I don't know. I don't personally prescribe to that terminology, but I think someone can feel like they are addicted. I think the feeling is very, very, very real. But whether it is an actual addiction, I don't know, because a lot of addiction programs, they promote abstinence, don't they? And like you mentioned, like with Overeaters Anonymous, their ethos is to abstain from like sugar, abstain from like highly processed carbs, like flour and everything.
Yeah.
And for some people, it actually might work. Like, if it works with people, great. But I think for a lot of people, that would be really difficult, because then you're falling into that like deprivation place again, and you start battling with what we've described a lot in this episode.
If you're struggling with food, if you're struggling with food obsession and disordered eating, dopamine alone, I don't think is going to be the only influencing factor in that. Because even outside of me addressing the physical restriction and the mental restriction within my binge eating, there was also the emotional side of things. There was the way in which I was using food to cope with parts of myself that I didn't want to show, and parts of myself that I felt shame about, and feelings that I didn't have the capacity to experience. And there were so many other contributing factors that I think if I'd have sat there and thought, right, I'm addicted to sugar, it gives me this high, it's related to dopamine, that's what this is. I need to, like, I think in her book, does she call it restricting dopamine? She says, I can't remember. She says basically of essentially restricting yourself of that dopamine, right? To try and balance out the seesaw. I would have still been binging because there were other factors that were going on there. But again, just to reiterate to what you say, I definitely felt like I was addicted to food at some stages of my disordered eating. When you are eating food out of a bin, you definitely feel like there is a problem. There is something wrong with you. And so I don't want this to come across like we're dismissing people's experience. And we always welcome comments and emails. We want to hear of people's experience of this, because all of this is so very complex and there is nuance to everything. Our conversations are hopefully to give people different things to think about within this process.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a one piece of a bigger puzzle.
Absolutely. I'm aware that like it's getting darker, and if we carry on for much longer, I'm just going to be a black screen.
You'll just be a face.
I'll just
hovering
be a
face.
face and a light on my microphone. So we will
On the microphone that Katie doesn't know how to work.
Never going to let that go, are you?
She was like, "Oh, that button actually does something." She was like, "I just didn't think these buttons did anything."
Not my finest moment, and I'm sure we'll do it again.
I wish we'd had it recorded.
That would have been funny, wouldn't it?
It would.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
Let us know your thoughts.
Please let us know what you thought, whether you relate to what we've shared or not. We always love your feedback.
Yes. Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.